that I always find it a little daunting talking to parents because so much of what I know is information that you've given me. At CHOP, we work with families both clinically and in research. We rely upon you to help us understand what it's like for families going through childhood cancer. And today I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what we've heard from you. Another piece about being doing a presentation really to parents is the kinds of things that we learn in research never quite fit exactly your experience. So I'm also a little daunted by making generalizations, but I think it is helpful to hear, in general, what happens. Today I'm going to talk about coping with cancer really as a family journey. And what we hear from families is that this isn't a trip that they planned, it's not one that they looked forward to or booked in advance, but it definitely is a long journey, one that's very hard. Today we're going to talk a bit about a traumatic stress model that we at CHOP have found very useful in understanding coping with childhood cancer. And then I'm going to talk a bit about the psychosocial impact of childhood cancer on the family, and I'm going to talk specifically about parents, the patient, and also siblings. And then finally provide you with some suggestions for maximizing adjustment for each family member. So traumatic stress model of childhood cancer is one that has really built upon the early conceptualizations of post-traumatic stress disorder. And traumatic stress models have really been discussed and recorded in the literature dating all the way back to the 19th century. The first time it was really discussed was shortly after railway cars had been invented and had been coming into use. And at that time, rail travel was very dangerous. Rail cars were just wooden, there was very little protection for the passengers or the conductors, and they tended to get into quite a few accidents, hitting things on the rails, things like that. And the disorder was described called railway spine. And it included things like nightmares about railway travel, a real desire to avoid anything related to trains, and also chronic pain. Around the same time, hysteria was being diagnosed in women. And some of the symptoms of that included agitation and dissociation, or kind of attachment from oneself. And then, of course, there are many different types of disorders described related to war. The first of these was soldier's heart, which included fatigue and cardiovascular reactivity, and then also shell shock, which included memory loss, emotional outbursts, and kind of numbing. So all of these conceptualizations, these early conceptualizations, were combined with other observations throughout the years, such as reactions of survivors of the Holocaust and battered children, survivors of rape. And these symptoms became more and more observable and recognized across these different kinds of events. And finally, in the 1980s, post-traumatic stress disorder was defined by the American Psychiatric Association. This was really a groundbreaking event in psychiatry, because for the first time, psychiatrists were describing a phenomenon, a type of distress, that they conceptualized as a normal reaction to an abnormal event. So this was described as something that almost anyone would experience if they were in these types of catastrophic situations. Over the years, a traumatic event has come to be described as one that involves actual or threatened death or serious injury or a threat to the physical integrity of the self or others. And the situation produces intense fear, horror, or helplessness in the person experiencing it. Symptoms include things like intrusive memories, avoidance, and physiological arousal, pulling from each of those early descriptions. And as this traumatic stress model has come to be more researched, the experience of childhood cancer has really been key in how it has come to be defined. there were very early field trials between the first definitions of traumatic stress and revisions of the traumatic stress model. It specifically looked at post-traumatic stress disorder in children with cancer and their mothers. Because of finding these symptoms specifically within these families, the diagnosis of a life-threatening illness and learning that one's child has a life-threatening illness were specifically listed among potentially traumatic events. So I want to spend a little time just talking through the symptoms of traumatic stress disorder and how we see this play out within families of kids with cancer. The first group of symptoms are re-experiencing symptoms. So these things include recurrent, intrusive, distressing recollections. And what we hear from families is thoughts of cancer will just pop into my mind while I'm driving down the street or while I'm trying to work. And I can't stop that from happening. Recurrent, distressing dreams. In kids, these might be nightmares. Acting or feeling as if the event is recurring. Now, this isn't typically the same sort of situation as a flashback, but rather driving to the hospital for, say, a checkup, and suddenly you feel like you're driving to the hospital again the same way you did when you're going through treatment. Also, intense psychological distress at exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble the event. So feeling very anxious about something that just represents cancer or treatment in one's mind. And physiological reactivity to these cues. So things like trembling or heart pounding or palm sweating, things like that. Avoidance and numbing is the second cluster of symptoms. And these are efforts to avoid thoughts, feelings, conversations, activities, places, or people who are involved with cancer or cancer treatment. We hear from families that they may change the channel if they see something about cancer on TV. They may try to avoid coming into the city if they were treated at CHOP. Examples also include inability to recall important aspects of the trauma, so there may be just some piece of the cancer experience that you just can't remember. Diminished interest or participation in activities, typically pleasurable events or activities. Feelings of detachment or estrangement, just feeling cut off from people who are important to you, friends and family. A restricted range of affect, where individuals just seem flat. They don't experience very low times, but they also don't experience a lot of happiness either. And also a sense of foreshortened future, which is just feeling like you're not going to accomplish the things that you would expect to. So in some survivors of childhood cancer, we may see they don't really expect to graduate from college or get married or have children. That's kind of unusual, actually, but when we're asking families about this, the question we ask is, do you see any changes in your future? And they typically say, yes, it's going to be wonderful. So kind of the opposite. Increased arousal is the last group of symptoms. And these include things like difficulty falling or staying asleep, irritability or outbursts of anger, difficulty focusing or concentrating, hypervigilance, and an exaggerated startle response. And most of these are pretty self-explanatory, but just want to take a few moments to talk about hypervigilance. In one interview with a mother, she reported that like every night after her child would go to sleep, she would check and see if he had any lumps or bumps. And that sort of hypervigilance, kind of looking to see if there's something that you could catch early on. An exaggerated startle response is just being a little jumpy and on edge. So to actually qualify for a diagnosis of PTSD, a person needs to have one of those first re-experiencing symptoms, 3 of the symptoms of avoidance, and 2 arousal symptoms. The symptoms last for at least a month and cause significant distress or impairment in functioning. Now, the traumatic stress model has really evolved over time. And from this first description of this psychiatric disorder, we're moving back towards this idea that traumatic responses and reactions are normal reactions to abnormal events. And the models these days continue to draw on the coping literature and actually reflect that these trauma symptoms may be normative and adaptive. And actually, in an evolutionary perspective, these things may ensure survival. So for example, distress communicates a need for support. Re-experiencing the event or it pops into your mind and you're dreaming about it allows you to process it cognitively and work through it. Avoidance clearly reduces distress, at least in the short term. If you can avoid something, it's not going to upset you. And arousal keeps you primed to recognize and deal with traumatic events. So if you're looking for the cancer to come back, you're ready for it. But why do people experience these specific symptoms is kind of a question. Why are traumatic events different from just a stressful event? And the idea behind this is that traumatic events really challenge the patterns of thoughts and behaviors that allow people to function on a daily basis. That we all have a certain conceptualization of the world. And we believe certain things, and those things let us get out of bed in the morning and do what we need to do. And when you experience a traumatic event that totally shakes and potentially, as the next quote says, reduces to rubble those thoughts and beliefs that you hold. So one series of researchers described a traumatic event as a psychologically seismic event that can severely shaken, threaten, or reduce to rubble many of the schematic structures that have guided understanding, decision-making, and meaning in the world. And we see this over and over again when kids ask, why me? Why do bad things have to happen to good people? We see this in parents when they say, I should have been able to protect my kid from this. We see it when families say, kids aren't supposed to die before their parents. These are core beliefs that people have that traumatic events raise these questions, or they just change the way we conceptualize the world. Now, the positive piece of that is that it doesn't need to lead to distress and problems in functioning, but it can also provide the opportunity for generative experiences, positive growth, and enhanced adjustment. It doesn't need to, but that's a possible outcome at the same time. So traumatic stress models recognize today that these catastrophic events don't need to lead to distress, but they can lead to enhanced functioning. So now a little on what the research shows about the psychosocial impact of cancer on families. There are many different patterns of response that are possible when a person is exposed to a traumatic event. And here are 5 different names of patterns that we see. So the first one is called hardy or hardiness. And in these individuals, they experience some minimal temporary distress, but for the most part, they're pretty well functioning. And they stay pretty level, things don't get too out of control, they're hardy people. Then there are chronically distressed people, which are kind of at the other end of the spectrum. They are also very flat and kind of consistent in their response, but they're highly distressed. So distress from the beginning and on through treatment. Then there are resilient people who experience very high levels of distress around the time of diagnosis, and then over time that distress improves. There are people who experience delayed distress, where they're doing pretty okay during treatment, but then later on in life, they see some higher levels of distress. And then also enhanced functioning, where people actually do better than they were doing before the traumatic event, or in this case, before the cancer. And these can be combined. So a person can seem resilient and then develop delayed distress, or can seem hardy and then display enhanced functioning. So it's not like cut and dry.